I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 8, Episode 14 of Music is Not a Genre. Do it with me, MXG. This week's topic, The Great Producers, Part 4, A Tale of Two 80s. So thank you as always for watching and listening. Again, please stick around for the mid-roll. It's got a lot of important information and ways that you can help support this show and a bunch of other things. Nothing new to report. Other than that, this week I'm working on some new recorded material that I've mentioned here and there, and I will mention again when there is something for you to check out. But since there is nothing right now, let's get right to the topic, which again, and I just said it, but let me repeat it. It bears repeating. The Great Producers, Part 4, A Tale of Two 80s. So yes, this is the 4th episode in my series on the great producers throughout history. And it's on the 1980s, and the subtitle, Tale of Two 80s, why? I've mentioned this in other episodes, particularly maybe in my albums series, etc., and other times that I've talked about the 80s at large. And what I've said is that the music of the 80s can be fairly clearly divided into the first and second half of the decade. So what we think of when we categorize and characterize the 80s as the big 80s sound was really the second half. Well, the first was much tighter, less awash in reverb. And those are just a couple of the major differences that make this essentially 2 decades, a tale of two 80s. And I will be going over all of this. And of course, going over all the great producers of the decade and all the various changes. Show format, in fact, is I'll go over the tech and music changes that happen in the decade. Bit special this time, and when we get there, you'll see why. Then I will spotlight the producers, and then conclusions, featured song, and questions. And this week's bonus M Extra on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre is your recommended listening. I give you a list of songs and albums that marked key transitions in music production in the 1980s. In other words, we talk about the tale of two 80s. Well, what key songs, key albums made that sound so different? And there was a bit of a transitional period there in the middle of the decade as well. But this list is going to go from almost the beginning of the decade straight through to 1989, I believe, is the last selection. And these are not my favorites. They're not the best, quote unquote, or any kind of ranking. They're just suggested listening of possibly the most representative recordings of the 1980s sound development. And they very much illustrate how and why the halves of the decade were so different. Again, that is the bonus M Extra at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. You'll hear me doing little pauses and tripping over my words today, and it's primarily because for some reason in this makeshift studio, the heat was jacked up to like 78. So I'm doing my best to kind of adjust to that. And yes, makeshift studio, DIY t-shirt. DIY t-shirt, by the way, DIY became a very big thing in the 1980s, including the Peter Gabriel song, DIY. Sources for this, Wikipedia, Google, Music Radar, 12bitsoul.com. Disclaimers, I will go into some of the tech, of course, as always, to illustrate how it affected the music, but not so detailed as to make this a tech episode. As always, while my producer choices are not arbitrary, they are likely incomplete, and they're probably biased to a degree. Again, most great producers worked in more than one decade, so what I try to do is include them in the decade in which they made the biggest impact. If you don't hear a producer who started in the 80s and made greater impact in the 90s, that's why. I may mention a producer again, in fact, in this episode if their impact kind of straddled the 70s and 80s. So let's just get right to the first section here, tech and music changes. The biggest change to this section for this decade is possibly the peak of what I have been alluding to all along in this series, and I've mentioned before in other episodes, which is that tech influences music as much as music influences tech. And because of how both of these changed in the 1980s in particular, I'm going to talk about them together. Unlike the first few episodes where I started with the tech changes and then went into how that affected changes in music, they are far too intertwined in the 1980s to separate. And I just end up repeating myself, so I'm going to talk about them together. But The second thing about this section is that there will be two parts to it, as follows: the tech and music changes altogether, as mentioned, and how different the first and second halves of the decade really were. Some key points as to why they were so different. Of course, again, if you want concrete examples of how they sounded different and what that transition was like, go to the bonus M Extra, patreon.com/music is not a genre, for your recommended listening, which will be in chronological order, so you can kind of map that transition, all the changes. So first, tech and music advancements. I'm going to go over some of the more granular changes and how they affected music, and then I'm going to hit you with what I think are the two biggest advancements of the decade. So if you haven't heard them, if you think, why hasn't he mentioned them? It's because I'm saving them for the last in this list. So these first four, they go together. They're elements that probably any of you can pick out, even if you are not recording artists or musicians or engineers of any kind. That's how much they define the 80s sound, so much that most of us can mention them and spot them and hear them, even if you're not professionals. So number one, drum machines as the spine of a track. So in the 1980s, you had, of course, further developments in electronic drums, in drum machines, beatboxes, whatever you would call them. They've been around for a while, but they really took effect more than ever in the 1980s, and it's kind of a never look back decade for that. You had the Linn drum machine, LN1. You had of course the 808, the Roland TR-808, which is iconic, especially in hip hop, and the 909. And they ended up not just as they might have done for some of the 70s, enhancing live drumming and live percussion. They replaced live drummers on countless records, which means beats became precise, they became repeatable, they became programmable. And so instead of rhythm and beats being more about performance, they became more about design. They became more about who's this person who knows or think they know enough about drum machines and what they want that drum machine to do in this particular song to design a certain beat that fit the song in the way they wanted it to, as opposed to riffing. And I can tell you from the standpoint of having worked with drum machines for a really long time, you can also riff on a drum machine if you're playing the pads, if it's a padded drum machine. If you're just sequencing, it's a little bit different, but you can still do a little bit of riffing. That you can discover beats that way, but it's nowhere near the kind of riffing and discovery you can have with a live drummer. So that really changed the nature of what a beat meant. And when you think of the 808, it's iconic. It's the foundation of hip hop and trap and pop, and you hear sub bass and long decays and tuned drums. Those things came from the changes in this decade to using drum machines so frequently and so prominently. And these days, because of the change in the 1980s, producers still build tracks from the drum machine up. Not always, but that's very often the most common way that a track is built up, even when using samples. So number two, synths as primary instruments, not color. So prior to that, of course, synths had been around a really long time. Electronic music had been around for far longer than most of us realize, 30s, 40s, something like that. But of course, they really took effect quite a bit in the 1970s, but kind of as color, as mentioned, as enhancement to a live band, except for certain exceptions like Kraftwerk and stuff like that, which I'll be talking about more next week in the next bonus episode. But in the 80s, synths became as important, if not more important, than live instruments. You had synths like the Jupiter 8, the DX7, the Prophet 5. Later on in the decade, you had the Ensoniq, the Korg, a bunch of them. They were not accents. They carried the melody, the bass, the harmony, the hooks. When my cover band plays 80s covers, we're working on an 80s show, a request show, actually. And we realized that we may end up needing a second keyboard, which is not something we've ever done. I've done it a long, long time ago. I did it in a band, but it's not something I ever really wanted to do, frankly. But it's something that was so extremely common in the 1980s that when you hear a recording, you are likely hearing 2, 3, 4 keyboard sounds layered on top of each other. And so that was a huge, huge change. And that became part of the design the way drum machines did, in the sense of you were designing the sound based on the patches that you used and the keys, how you layered them. And even though functionally, or in terms of the hardware, that's not how I work anymore. Really, when I build a track, I do that still. I will layer drum sounds, I will layer keyboard sounds, and not to make them as separate, but as one new sound, as a layered sound, and sometimes separate as well. And that's a big thing in the 80s. Number 3, gated reverb and artificial space. Producers used gated reverb to create huge explosive drums that then stopped abruptly. So you know what they wanted at the time was a snare that went, but instead of, if you did that with reverb, it would go and have a long tail. The gate would go, and so that iconic snare sound, that's more reverb in the snare, and it's a gated reverb. And so you're going to get a lot of that additional added sweetener on tracks, on even certain parts of certain tracks from the 1980s on. That's something that still happens today. It's part of the kind of ambience of recording. Number 4, compression as attitude. So compression was not subtle. The drums pumped, vocals sat on top. Everything had its space. It wasn't this kind of congealed mass. And even though some of these developments did start in previous decades, you had a decent amount of separation starting in the 1960s, certainly more in the 70s with more tracks, etc., etc. In the 1980s is really where you had this idea of, well, the vocals can sit here in front and have their own dedicated space and frequency for the most part. And the drums you're not just hearing the kick and the snare in some kind of unbalanced way. Each one hits equally, which is something you could do with, miking drums in a certain way prior to that, but never more so than in the 1980s. And even though dynamics would change drastically in the 90s and 2000s especially, this is where it really started, that kind of compressing. And it was in part to cut through for MTV, for music video, and it was in part just because that was the style. It went from this kind of, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, this kind of middle frequency that the 70s are very much known for, to the higher frequencies and that thumping bass, which came out of when disco morphed into dance and high energy and eventually EDM and all of those things, house and techno. You needed that aggressive kick, the aggressive drums. So that was another big part of the changes here. And vocals being way up front. I still deal with this with my recordings, in that how much of the bass do you want to kick? Well, these days, as much as possible, even certainly more so. When you think of the 80s, you're like, I can't believe that was what was considered heavy bass back then for almost all recordings. And it would change in the 90s especially, and the 2000s, forget it. But the same thing can be said for vocals, where there were other recordings prior where you wanted the vocals to be up front. But now, and you can talk about heavy metal, hard rock, almost every genre wanted those vocals super up front, which was not necessarily how it always was, or how it would be later. And we'll talk about the kind of backlash to the 80s later on. These next 3, they're kind of the bridge between the first 4 and the next 3, the final 3, or the final 3 of the main list, as helping to set the flavor and tone of the decade. So number 1, minimalism is a power move, especially in hip hop. So early hip hop producers would strip tracks down to just rhythm and voice, unlike hip hop of the late 1970s, where it was more kind of a funk disco offshoot. In the 80s, it became more electronic, and so you could have literally just a beat and a rapper, or a beat and a rapper and maybe one other thing. And that gave that vocalist much more authority, and the song itself much more clarity. And that is something that has continued through. In fact, there is that sort of contrast or competition almost between producers who like to layer and producers who don't. Sparse arrangements, dense arrangements. I like both. I tend to lean more towards dense because I like to produce things to where if you listen to it a second, third, fourth time, you're discovering things you didn't hear the first time. But there are some times where just having one or two or three or at most four things going on at once is very powerful move. It's sort of like when you're an actor and they tell you your role is one of authority and almost instilling fear in the people who are listening to you, you don't do it big. The smaller you are, the more you talk like intimate, and you say, I hope you're listening to me, as opposed to I hope you're listening to me, which sounds insecure. That intimacy, that's stripped down, a lot of authority. And number two, again, vocals as the absolute center. So producers pushed vocals louder, clearer, and more dominant than ever before. Kind of the offshoot of what we were talking about with compression. They also added effects which enhanced the presence without burying the clarity of the vocal. So you could have, let's say, a side chain or whatever, where you're pumping in a reverb that doesn't overpower the vocal itself, but enhances it in ways that you didn't hear much of in the 1970s, except for some of the more experimental people. And this, again, is something that I have both defaulted to and actively tried to avoid because of my massive production influences of the 1980s and 90s. And often the combination of that becomes very 2000s, which to me was the compromise of the two. And the first truly modern era decade, to me, the 2000s. And of course, we'll get there in a couple of episodes in this series. But I struggle, again, with how much of the vocal to put on a track. There are times where I've been told that the vocal sounds too buried. This is coming from people who are used to hearing that 80s or 60s sound, or sometimes the 70s sound where the vocal is so prominent, but especially 80s. And there are times where I feel like the vocal is so loud that it overshadows the rest of the track, and it's almost like the track is karaoke, like a backing track, and then there's a vocal. That was very common in the 1980s, for the vocal to be that loud. That would happen, of course, pop and hip hop. There'd be a lot of doubling of vocals and over processing of vocals, or just, let's say, processing of vocals. It's your taste. Sometimes, you might hear it as over processing. And then number three in this section, emotional maximalism, or the complete opposite of that. So in the 80s, it was big feelings. It was big sounds. It was big, we call it the big 80s. But what? Only some artists embraced that, and that embrace happened more and more as the decade went on in at least the mainstream, whereas in the first half of the decade, that wasn't quite happening. It was happening, but not to nearly the same degree, and what you had more there was understatement, kind of rejecting that maximalism, and that would end up, there'd be like a crisscross here, where you started in the early 80s with minimalism that then was mainstream and went underground, and the maximalism that was underground and went mainstream. And then, when we get to the 90s, we'll talk about what happened there. Basically, rejected all of it. The next three, they go together, and they kind of can't be separated because it's speaking to work style and flow. And number one is big tech and music change in the 80s, studio as an instrument. Producers like, I'll be mentioning later on, Trevor Horn, especially Brian Eno, Prince, treated the studio as a tool. And I've mentioned this in previous episodes, but again, I think this was sort of the peak, and everything that came after was kind of modeling that idea of studio as tool. It was the 1980s. You could have just a song, and this is a struggle that a lot of artists go through, where their fans or certain people might say, oh, I liked your acoustic version better. And that's fine. That's taste. When you're a producer, you want that sound that you have in your head to be fully realized, and it's got layers and stuff like that. It doesn't mean that it's better or worse than the acoustic version. It's just a certain style. That really came to a peak in the 1980s. So you had layering and more micro editing, a lot of looping and manipulating sounds in ways that you couldn't do live, not at the time. You could do anything live now. That was the beginning the beginning of the more kind of practical use of DAWs, digital audio workstations, was the 1980s. Cubase, I don't remember when Cubase came about. That's something I just seem to remember. Or Motu, Master of the Universe. Not just recording tools, but they were part of the composition of the song. And you could build a song in fragments. Oh, I want to shift this and move it to a different section. I want to start with the chorus instead of having it come after the first verse, things like that. You were assembling a song as much as you were performing it. Number two, genre hybridization. So in the 1980s, pop absorbed how many freaking genres? Funk, rock, R&B, electronic, disco, experimental music. It absorbed all of that. And producers deliberately ignored genre purity in favor of impact and uniqueness. And I think never more so than in two particular decades, the 1980s and now. In between, there was a lot more purity with genre, not entirely, but more so. And certainly before. But in the 1980s, it was the first time where the idea was, it wasn't just quirky to combine genres in, let's say, a pop song or even a rock song. It was practically a necessity because that's what everybody was doing, and it meant that you were bold. It meant that you were attracting attention. And so pop and hip hop and EDM hybrids dominated the charts. Indie music borrowed from synth pop and R&B and dance in subsequent decades. And then number three, the producer as auteur. We talked about this before, but you had, again, the ability, because of digital audio workstations and the equipment was cheaper, you could have a 4-track or an 8-track in your home. Some, if you had more money, 16-track, whatever. And you could do your own full recordings on your own, and didn't need anyone except people you might have hired, unless you could play all the instruments yourself. That was kind of that auteur thing. And that was in part because so much of the creativity of the song and the structuring of the song happened in the studio. And so these last two, as promised, are the biggest changes. To me, the ones that more or less underlie and make possible everything above. And that's number one, MIDI. Musical instrument digital interface. It was introduced in 1983. It made controlling digital sounds possible. So for the first time, synths, drum machines, computers could all talk to each other. Instead of patching in prior to that, you played a synth, you could maybe sequence it depending, or a drum machine, in a quantized way. And we'll talk a little bit more about quantization later, but not much. Again, not a tech episode. But you were doing it and patching it into the system, to the board, in analog through like a 1/4 inch or XLR sometimes, with a DI, a direct box, all of that. Whereas with MIDI, you didn't need any of that. You went directly into the system. And so it would lock performances to a grid. It would allow producers to build songs layer by layer instead of capturing full takes all at once. This helped to find that tight mechanized feel of 80s pop and synth pop and R&B and some of the hip hop as well, while also shifting music making toward programming over performance. And we talked about that before. MIDI is more than anything what made that possible. And beyond the 80s, forget it. I don't use MIDI cables anymore because it's all USB, but within the USB are the MIDI, it's the MIDI programming, basically. So I have my keyboard that attaches to my computer that I use in my DAW, and it's done via USB, but that's still sending signals via MIDI. And the second big thing is sampling. Early samplers turned recorded sound into raw material. I had an early sampler, at least over-the-counter one, and I think I have a version of it back there, the Casio. Was it the SK1? I can't remember. Don't quote me on that. But it would give you the ability to sample just a small bit, a few seconds of something, and then play it on the keyboard. And that's when you hear that sound where it's burp, burp, beep, beep, burp, 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 where the voice would modulate with it, or whatever it was you were sampling. That's what early samplers did. They were short samples. You were unable to pitch correct for them, so you couldn't make a voice sound the same at a middle C as you could at a G or a high C. Those changes would come later in the 90s and beyond. But that sampling made such a huge impact on music that, again, it's something we've never looked back from. And there are things we use as recording artists, as musicians, that we don't realize are samples that come from sampling, that it's just second nature now. And whereas here, it just so defined so much of the sound in the 1980s. And when we talk about somebody like Trevor Horn and the art of noise and hip hop and all of that, 80s sampling fueled hip hop's explosion, of course. A little bit in the beginning, but certainly by the end of the decade. It enabled maximalism because you could use how many different samples. If you go to whosampled.com and there's a song, it'll pick a song and find there's like 30 samples in that song. It's insane. It helped blur lines between genres. Producers could quote and loop and recontextualize their favorite songs and the past in real time. So the records could evoke the feelings of previous eras while still being modern, and could be dense, could be more confrontational. I dare you to, like both eras or to find out where I got this from. Of course, it eventually reshaped copyright law. And in the 80s, it was kind of the Wild West. You can use whatever sample you wanted until the late 80s, when those laws kind of started to, people got sued, et cetera, et cetera. But that was huge. And so the bottom line, modern music doesn't just reference the 80s. It runs on the systems that were invented, or at least became the peak then. And those are the things that I just mentioned. So now, even when artists choose either rawness or authenticity, or the combination of those two, kind of raw and authentic, they're reacting against the 1980s. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that a little later on. Let's do a little more before we take a break here. So how were the first and second halves of the decade different? This is the second part of this, intro section, let's say. This may be my favorite part of the episode because I'm obsessed with two things. One, how cliche people are when they reference what 80s music sounded like, and that they usually default to the second half of the decade. And two, how despite clear connections, like increased presence of electronics and, let's say, drama, the first half of the decade was a very different sounding era. More like some of the late 70s changes, but understanding more of what those changes could achieve and how to best use them. So early 80s, from 1988-84, around about, you have more experiment, more transition, more uncertainty. You were discovering and learning the tools, and so they weren't baked in to the point where everybody was using the same way. And there was a lot of mixing still of analog and digital. So performances still mattered, etc. Space was more mysterious. It wasn't meant to be as dramatic. Sound and technique, synths were present, but not yet total in, let's say, rock, in, let's say, even hip hop. That would come a couple of years later. In, of course, dance and new wave and all of that, synths were extremely present, but they were still considered in the mainstream a bit of an outsider. It was quirky and unique new wave at the time. Drums, again, lots of drum machines still being used, but they weren't baked in as the default in the early 80s. That's why you have that drier production value in the early 80s, to where it was almost like it was a live drummer doing a drum machine, because they still wanted to retain some of that, live performance feel. And then the ambience became atmosphere. So reverb was there, but it wasn't overwashing everything, the snares, the vocals, and stuff. Rooms, if they had that cavernous sound, it was, they think about Bauhaus and goth and certain other genres where you wanted that mysterious kind of washy sound, whether on the vocals or on the drums as a kit, or the drum machine, or the guitar, especially when you think of the kind of echoey guitars of U2 and a lot of those post-punk bands. Mixing, more dynamic range. There wasn't as much compression in the early 80s. The vocals were prominent but not dominant. You then get to the late 1980s, and we'll go through this before we take a break, and you have more control, more confidence, and more spectacle. That people understood how to use everything now. So they exploited it all. So, we're going to use drum machines everywhere. We're going to use sampling everywhere, keyboards everywhere, reverb and gated reverb everywhere. And that was consistent across all formats and genres. As a matter of fact, there were very few genres except for underground where you didn't hear that. To one degree or another, some more tastefully than others. So, some of the sound and technique, synths became the infrastructure. They weren't just color, and they weren't just experimental in very dynamic and deliberate ways in the early 80s. They became the song in the late 80s, in the second half of the 80s. Drums dominated. Drum machines dominated. And when you think about a band like Duran Duran, was a live band, had a live drummer. They would either do remixes with a drum machine or have a drum machine on there in addition to the live drummer, and that was an extremely common thing. It's something I still do to this day. I often combine live drums with drum machines, but I also often just use drum machines, and every now and then just use live drums as well. Compression as force, heavy compression across drums and vocals, as I mentioned before, that was a second half of the 80s development, not the first half. Loudness was prioritized, which is a joke in some ways to me, because when you think of the loudness wars of the 2000s and you go back and listen to the 80s and you say, well, the biggest difference in the 80s version of a song and the remastered version of that 80s song is the loudness more than anything else. And yet that kind of loudness thinking started in the 1980s. Vocals as command, again, extremely forward, extremely polished, separated vocals, stacking and doubling, making them thicker, making them more impactful. Every single aspect of a recording in the late 80s was meant to have its own impact. And not just its own impact, because that's happened before then too, but it have a large impact. And again, this is a generalization. There were producers who understood subtlety more, et cetera, et cetera. Arrangement as formula. So verse-chorus dynamics became exaggerated. When we think of grunge, we think of the soft, loud, soft, or whatever it is. That was starting to happen in the 1980s, even in genres like pop, to where you had the verse, there's a ba, 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 and the vocals came up in the chorus. That had happened to some degree before, but not to this degree. And so the distinction between the two, early 80s exploration, late 80s exploitation, early 80s ambiguity, late 80s clarity, early texture, late impact, early performance, late programming, early emotion through space, late emotion through force. And why does this matter before we get to the break? Because early 80s and late 80s values are how we live now. When you hear indie, ambient, lo-fi, post-punk, stripped down, that's early 80s. When you hear layers and dynamics and drama and some EDM and arena rock, that's late 80s. So we are either choosing early 80s or late 80s as producers and performers and recording artists, whether you know it or not. Before we get to the producers, the great producers of the 1980s, we're going to take a break. Please stick around for this very short mid-roll. It's very important to me and the show, and I think you'll find it interesting, and there might be something there for you. We'll be right back. Hey, MXG fans, thank you as always for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. You get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, go to nickdamadio.com/musicisnotagenre if you would rather just listen. And everyone, please take some time out to go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast, my band rec, and everything I do for as little as $1 a month. Speaking of everything I do, nickdamadio.com really does have it all. If you're interested in unique and quirky t-shirts that I've all personally hand designed, go to nickdamadio.com/shop and you can find it all there, including discounts if you sign up for my newsletter
or Patreon. If you're someone who's always wanted to write a song, has just never figured out how to get there, let me work with you. I am the Song Coach. Go to nickdamadio.com/thesongcoach, and whether you're a complete beginner or completely advanced, I can get you there. You can book a free 30-minute call right there on the site. And of course, I am always releasing new music. Go to nickdamadio.com/music to find it all. My complete discography is there. All of the social links are there. And of course, please like, share, subscribe, rate, review. Do it for the podcast. Do it for the music. Sharing is especially valuable to all of us indie creators. I really appreciate your support, your eyes and ears. Thank you for hanging with me for this mid-roll, and let's get back to the show.
All right, we are back, and let's get into the great producers of the 1980s. Again, you will notice I've left out some producers. Either I've mentioned them in the 1970s or I'm saving them for the 1990s. I will also re-mention some that I mentioned in the 1970s, second thoughts or for whatever reason. You might also notice that this is a very long list, so I'm going to try to give some structure to it and not so much speed through it, but really kind of get through it and end with the producers I think were the most important and influential. So if you think, hey, why hasn't he mentioned that? It's because I'm saving them for last yet again. Somebody I mentioned in the 1970s, Nile Rodgers, is part of the team with Bernard Edwards, but he deserves a mention here for the work he did mostly on his own for artists like David Bowie and Madonna and Duran Duran and Donna Summer very early on. Not Donna Summer, Diana Ross very early on. Nile Rodgers is still working to this day. Bernard Edwards sadly died through certain issues years ago, but Nile, I mean, his imprint on the 1980s sound is undeniable. He brought discipline and groove and elegance and a sense of arrangement that is impactful but subtle. It's stripped down, and yet it fills every space. The arrangements are clean, but they hit you. They still hit you. There's rhythmic clarity, the funk guitar, which I freaking love. That's him. I mean, you think about Let's Dance and that album. It helped define dance pop's golden age. And one of the things people say about the 80s quite often is that, my God, was everybody dancing all the time? And the answer is yes. We were dancing a hell of a lot. And I think that's awesome. And you think of disco in the 1970s, paled in comparison to what blew up in the 80s. And I think even the 80s were even more so than the 90s, despite rave culture, et cetera, because it became a little bit more factionalized in the 90s and 2000s to where you were either into dance or not, whereas in the 80s, every frickin' body was doing something that was danceable. And again, right, Nile Rodgers continues to work with artists straight up to this decade. But there's no doubt that his late 70s and early 80s work is the most seminal for him. Somebody else I mentioned again in the 1970s, Brian Eno, but deserves another short mention. Some of the key artists he worked with, U2, Talking Heads, and David Bowie. Eno reframed what a producer could be. He would often be kind of a therapist and a philosopher and say, how would you like to do this? Look up Oblique Strategies. Freaking love that. And I owned it once, I'm going to own it again. He would create that, ambient music was basically not his creation, but his coinage. And he helped artists think of their ambient sonic space and think more emotionally, encouraging the atmosphere and the texture, encouraging experimentation. And it's a credit to U2 that they wanted to work with him because they understood what he could do for them and where they wanted to go. But his work with them and with Talking Heads, the future of music wouldn't be the same without it. Speaking of, Daniel Lanois also worked with U2, worked with Peter Gabriel. And why he matters, he specialized in emotional atmosphere in a more concrete way, a structured way, let's say, than Eno. He knew the tools to use, echo, reverb, giving space where space was needed, but still warmth, which it's not that easy to have something that has both space and warmth. Trust me. He made records feel organic and spiritual and human at a time when everything was mechanized in the pop world. He gave music depth without sacrificing its scale. Think of U2. They had depth and scale. Speaking of, again, Steve Lillywhite, course, worked with U2, but also worked with XTC, Simple Minds, Susie and the Banshees, Big Country, The Smiths, The Pogues, Peter Gabriel. His signature was clarity and drama. He knew how to make bands sound urgent and punchy and arena ready, but also still retain their complexity and subtlety. He was able to balance art rock with commercial accessibility. And to me, in many ways, without knowing it, it's very possible that Steve Lillywhite is one of the, let's say, big influences on the way I hear music in my head, or at least a lot of the music I do. Someone else, Hugh Padgham, Phil Collins, Genesis, The Police. Padgham co-created the gated reverb drum sound, which we're going to talk about a little later, or I believe we're talking about it in the bonus M Extra on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre, where I give you recommended listening. And we talk about the advent of the gated reverb, the gated snare in particular. And of course, one of the most recognizable production signatures in history. It was like the cowbell of the 80s, basically. And he helped define the big, explosive, hyper-present sound of 80s rock and pop. Somebody who's popped up more lately in my listening, and that's Bob Clearmountain, as a producer, but especially as a key engineer. And I like to give props in each episode to at least one or two engineers, because they can shape a sound almost as much as a producer or the performers themselves can. And he worked with Tina Turner and Hall & Oates, The Pretenders, and Simple Minds, and that's just a small bit of who he worked with. He was good at translating dense, chaotic recordings into immaculate, powerful mixes that felt rich and big without losing their soul. And again, also Bruce Springsteen and Talking Heads and Roxy Music and David Bowie, that engineering, punchy drums, spatial depth, and emotional clarity, essentially inventing the modern idea of the mix engineer as a creative force. So Clearmountain is a pioneer. Mutt Lange, I never knew if it was Lang or Lange, but I'll say Mutt Lange. Key artist, Def Leppard, AC/DC, and Foreigner. He turned rock into precision. So you had the bigness of Led Zeppelin, and we talked about them in the last episode of this series, and how, my God, Jimmy Page, sorry, that escaped me for a second, produced those albums in a way that made them big, but sprawling as well. And Mutt Lange took that and made it more precise. So when you think of bands like Def Leppard, AC/DC, Foreigner, their sound is very precise, but it's still big, multi-tracked vocals, massive guitars, and a more perfectionism than you would have seen in the 70s. And that's what made those hard rock bands and songs into pop hits. Stock Aitken Waterman, who worked with Kylie Minogue, Rick Astley, Bananarama. Those people, that crew, SAW, Stock, Aitken, and Waterman, were a hit factory. They were the Max Martin before Max Martin existed. They had assembly line pop, delivering irresistible hooks with ruthless efficiency. While a lot of critics were like, it's hollow, it's shallow, it's whatever, their influence on pop production and songwriting systems has never gone away. And then, of course, you gotta give it up to the auteur, Prince. He worked with himself, of course, but also produced all those acts at the time: Sheila E., Sheena Easton, all the girl group side projects, Vanity Six and Apollonia 6, whatever. And his general influence on other music of the decade. He helped shape the sound of the decade because of his impact. He was a one-man production freaking universe. Writing, arranging, playing, engineering. I think his albums always said written, produced, composed, and performed. I think that was the order by Prince. There was those four things. I don't remember if that was the exact order. And it's something I've done sometimes just as an homage to Prince. He fused funk, rock, pop, and sexiness into a singular sonic identity. And he was able to show that you could be an auteur while not sounding insular, at least for the first, several years of his career, a couple decades maybe. And then his, the people that were greatly influenced by him, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who worked with, of course, Janet Jackson, but also the Human League. They modernized R&B and pop funk by blending the grooviness of the 70s and early 80s with synths and drum machines. And their productions were sleek, but still human. They were precise and rhythmic and quantized, but they still had a sense of intimacy. And you cannot deny the impact of Janet Jackson's Control and Rhythm Nation 1814. Some not mentioned enough online: Full Force, the crew behind UTFO and Lisa Lisa and Cult Jam. It was again a hit factory, but on the more kind of pop R&B dance side as opposed to stock Aiken Waterman. They were equal parts producers, writers, and performers. They often performed on their own productions. They specialized in aggressive hooks, ready to be repeated and chanted, and punchy beats. I mean, I can hear Lisa Lisa songs in my head right now because of their, and UTFO's songs. Early hip hop, R&B, and pop were so shaped by them. And they helped shape the sound of, more in particular, late 80s. And they were honestly able to be precise, but still raw and kind of, loose and kind of, street, but still catchy. And that was something to me that was in somewhat of short supply in the second half of the 80s. They were some of my favorite productions from Full Force in the late 80s. They kind of bypassed what became bombastic tastelessness and did it the right way. And there are people that I mentioned in, I think, the first or second season of this podcast. And here are there's some more producers here, and these are some key hip hop producers. So Bobby Robinson, who started working certainly before the 1980s, but he worked with people like Spoonie G, Treacherous 3, early Dougie Fresh, Lovebug Starsky, Harlem World Roster. He was one of the critical bridges between that early street live instrument hip hop that wasn't recorded and recorded hip hop. So he was able to translate that live feeling of performing hip hop at a club or, at a dance party, at a block party, and put it on wax, basically. And he did that, taking it from the Bronx and Harlem. He was already, like I said, a veteran R&B producer. He was a label owner. He as much as Sylvia Robinson, helped to legitimize hip hop as a recorded art form. Larry Smith, again, not mentioned often enough. He worked with Houdini, but he worked with Run DMC, and he was even given a shout out. And he was kind of future thinking, forward looking, even during early hip hop. He brought drum machines and synth bass and sci-fi textures into hip hop when it was still mostly rooted in live band. And when you think about Run DMC's Raising Hell and the work of Houdini, it was very kind of cold, hard, and minimalist, but also dynamic, forceful. It didn't have like a syncopated beat or a super funky groove that was more like goom, goom. That was a Larry Smith kind of signature. And he wasn't the main architect of electronic hip hop, but he really played a big part. Herbie Lovebug Azor worked with Salt and Pepper and Kid and Play, and I assume other acts that had in the middle of their name. Probably not. The pop rap mastermind. He was able to pair hip hop beats with airtight pop song writing. And that was really the time when you can talk about early hip hop hits and, Jam on It and Run DMC and even the Beastie Boys stuff. But it didn't really become a super pop thing until people like Herbie Lovebug Azor started creating Salt and Pepper songs and things like that, because they were genuine pop hits. He understood how to make a song pop while also still being hip hop. The Bomb Squad, Public Enemy. And I love this. I read this online. Controlled Chaos. When you hear Public Enemy's productions, you hear so much going on and so much energy from so many different places, and yet it's all controlled in a way that gives it momentum and force and clarity. And that's really the Bomb Squad. They layered dozens of samples and funk stabs and abrasive rhythms into a dense wall of sound that really came at you. it was aggressive in a way that I freaking love. So, you know, it takes a million that holds us back. You could be explosive both sonically and lyrically, and influence basically, you know, a whole strip of genres after industrial and you know, people like the Death Grips and experimental hip hop and stuff like that. And okay, Rick Rubin, have to mention him. Yes, some of you may argue that his 1990s work was even more substantial, but I feel like he did his most signature work in the 1980s, even though he did his more commercially impactful, let's say, and more financially successful work in the 90s and beyond, with, you know, Johnny Cash and Chili Peppers and all that. But in the 80s, Run DMC, Beastie Boys, Slayer, he brought both minimalism and aggression to the 80s, which was not easy to do. We talked about how minimalism can create impact without aggression, you know, with that kind of intimate, I'm going to kill you, you know, sound. But he was able to do both at the same time, minimalism and aggression. And he stripped production down to its essence. He just had just what was needed. And he helped push hip hop and metal into more of the mainstream. We forget that metal was not mainstream prior to this. And he helped influence the kind of genre blurring sound in the 1990s. And to close out this section, the hands down architects of what we think of as the 1980s sound, the biggest architects, let's say. The first one of these helped to shape, to me, the live sound of pop, and the second, the electronic sound of pop. And while both had crossover genres, the first one, who I'll mention soon, leaned from pop into kind of R&B and jazz. You may guess who I'm talking about. I've held him off for decades. While the second one leaned towards more rock and electro. And they're both hugely important. And of course, the first one, Quincy Jones. Michael Jackson, George Benson, Ray Charles, Miles Davis, Sinatra, Aretha, and Barbara, but Michael Jackson. Come on. He was an arranger. He didn't just produce records. He produced perfection, pop perfection, with still subtlety and depth. When you think of Off the Wall, and you of course think of Thriller and Bad, he was a genre bender, the way we talked about before, funk, R&B, rock, and jazz, and cutting-edge studio work into an unprecedented sound that, again, of the two I'm talking about, more than maybe anybody else, shaped the sound of the 80s and beyond. And we still listen more to his work than, you know, almost any other work, probably any other work from the 1980s, or almost anyway. He set the bar for modern blockbuster production. And the last one here, Trevor Horn. Think of Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Think of Yes' comeback album. ABC, his own band, The Art of Noise. He's often called the man who invented the 80s. He pioneered hyper-detailed, synth-driven, sampled studio as instrument productions. His recordings sounded more futuristic than almost anybody else working at the time. They sounded lavish and maximalist, and yet somehow still dynamic and, you know, live in terms of the feel. He did not use technology as a default or as a, well, this is the easiest thing to do. He embraced it and wanted more and more of it. And when you think of that kind of like a horn, sampled horn hits and things like that, and his name is Trevor Horn. Geez, what a coincidence. You cannot think of the 80s without thinking of Trevor Horn, period. So some conclusions. The 1980s separated music from sound. Why? Because before the 80s, songs were largely judged by their composition and performance. In the 80s, sound itself became such a primary force in whether or not a song was considered good or worthy that this is even a criticism sometime of the 80s and of everything after, which is that how much does production and production values, how much do they influence whether or not you think a song is good, or let's say the Grammys think a song is good? Is it just it again became much more about production than even about composition. And so many modern genres have been, defined by that. The 80s taught everybody that how something sounds can be an art in itself. There were seeds of this in the previous decades, but it was the 1980s when it became the default. Or you reacted against it and made it deliberately not the sound of something. And I prefer people who pay more attention to sound than kind of go anti-sound, because you're recording. So why not use recording as part of your toolkit? But it's also why the explosion of subgenres really started then, because you had that sense of complexity in how you were producing, and you can go in so many different directions in the studio that all of a sudden you didn't just have one type of EDM. You had 5 types, or whatever you want to say. The producer became a co-author, or sometimes the author. So the 80s normalized the idea that the producer shaped the identity of the artist, not just the recordings. That happened before in terms of manufactured artists like the Archies, and when you put together a band in the studio, that was happening for decades. But in terms of taking an already established artist and saying, we're going to do X for your identity, that was a big 80s thing, and has been ever since. Ever since. You have, again, Max Martin and Timbaland and fudging Jack Antonoff creating identities for artists by how they produce. The studio became the primary instrument, was a conclusion. We talked about this before, but this is something I think always deserves repeating. Recording stopped just being, let's capture what a band does live. You create it in the studio. Sure, you can say that's what the Beatles did, but they were pioneers of stuff like that. Other people had done it slightly before the Beatles, and certainly after the Beatles, but they were always considered the exception rather than the rule. When the 80s came, that's what you did. Okay, we do X live, but what are we going to do in the studio? How are we going to make this recording sound? Editing and layering and looping and processing became more core acts of the composition of the song, as opposed to just changing the sound of the song. And, digital audio workstation started to become the main thing towards the late 80s. You could take parts of songs, fragments, and put them together to create a full song. People had done that before in terms of their compositional work. You hear even the Beatles and Bowie and people say, like, oh, that was actually 2 or 3 songs and I put it into one, like Happiness is a Warm Gun or something like that. But we're talking about a song, from scratch, created by taking the fragments. You didn't like the order, you changed the order, you repeated this, you cut this out, you added this here. And so it was like an assembled song in the studio. That was a big development in the 1980s. Technology became expressive, not neutral. So instead of it being the antithesis of emotion, technology became the emotion. Drum machines, synths, and such like that were considered more robotic in the 1970s and even early 80s. Although that was that transitional period where you had new wave bands understanding that you could get emotion out of electronic instruments, they became emotional tools as much as live instruments, and in some ways you might even say, more. And it had things that existed that didn't exist in where do you hear a gated snare? It's very difficult to find a space where you can gate an echo or a reverb in life. Think of it that way. And even though a sequencer was the opposite of human, you were so deliberately creating within your sequencer, and I used to do this a ton on the keyboards I had, in particular the Korg 01W Pro. You created human sounding and human feeling structures by sequencing. So this kind of cleared the runway for electronic music and hip hop and composition in the digital workstations. The 70s considered electronic music as deliberately non-human, cold, dystopian, or quirky, weird, comedic even. And the 1980s showed electronics could be as human, as expressive as analog. And now we tend to hear both interpretations of electronic music since then. Lean into the cold, lean into the expressive. Early hip hop and electronic music found legitimacy. So the same tools that powered pop, drum machines, samplers, sequencers, enabled hip hop and electronic music to exist outside traditional musicianship. So much of what I read in that book, Sweet Dreams, was about how this DIY t-shirt ethic of offshoot of punk, where punk was like, we don't have to play that well. We just have to play, forcefully, dynamically, and have good songs, or what have you, and perform well. That came through also in the electronic world, where there were people who didn't understand music theory, didn't know how to play any instruments, but they could sequence, they could program, they could play a drum machine. And that created some of the most amazing music, but more so created the modern landscape of music that we have today. Control replaced chance as the dominant value. So I like both. I like to have enough control to have some structure and a sense of consistency, let's say, and precision in some ways, but I leave room for chance as well. In the 80s, you had mostly control. That's why, whatever, when you think of 80s beats, when you think of 80s pop, in the vocals in many ways, there was still chance, but not so much in the rest of the instruments. Your production was grid-based. I could see that grid in my head. I mean, in fact, there's one in front of me right now recording the audio for this on a separate track, which is why my audio tends to sound so damn good. Plus, I'm an audio engineer anyway, and I'm looking at the grid. Quantization became the default as opposed to, well, we need to nudge this. And now these days, quantization, you have to quantize at least part of what you do for almost every genre. You have to pitch correct for a lot of what you do. I don't quantize and pitch correct everything because it can take the, that certain quality out of it that you want, that element of chance, but most I actually do, Expectation of sonic consistency across platforms, even genres that reject this are responding to it. How much chance do I allow in my music? Which to quantize and pitch correct? Which to leave as is? I like to leave room for happy accidents, but within a structure. Loudness, presence, and immediacy became norms. 80s records were designed to cut through the noise. We talk about the internet and things having to cut through the noise. That really started more than ever in the 1980s. Car stereos, radio, MTV, clubs. If you're walking down the street with a Walkman or eventually a Discman and there's noise, you needed to be able to hear the music, then that needed to be compressed. The vocals needed to be up front. The drums needed to be punchy. Guitars needed to be punchy. That's why everything sounds, to our ears, unremastered, very tinny from the 1980s, as opposed to the decades that came before and after. Loudness wars started then. Actually, no, they didn't start then. The idea of things needing to be louder started then. Loudness wars wouldn't happen for another, decade or two at least. But the thought of things being pop, even when they weren't pop, really did start then more than ever. So if you were a heavy metal act, you still structured your songs like pop songs in many ways, short intros, and you got to the chorus quickly and stuff like that. The start of our modern obsession with immediate capture of attention and trying to retain it as long as possible was in the 1980s. And in some ways that pressure has created some great and amazing music, and in other ways it's kind of cheapened music. While all of the above are crucial, these last three conclusions are the most crucial to me. One is genre became flexible. Production became the identity. So the 80s, it may not have begun this, but it's where hard genre boundaries really disappeared. And again, to me, that has not happened to that degree until maybe 30 years after that. The teens and 20s, we're seeing a lot of genre mixing. But in between, there was more stringent, well, if you were grunge, you did grunge, you didn't put a keyboard in there and things like that. And the 80s just put everything together. I think a lot of what people are responding to when they hear Rex music, my music, is that idea that I like to mix a shitload of influences together. I am not trying to be sonically pure or genre pure in any way. Modern music's fluidity owes more to 80s producers than any later movement. We can take for granted now that we can genre hop at will. And even though that was far less the case as fans. I've mentioned in the 80s how you were either a fan of rock or a fan of hip hop. You couldn't be both. And for older people, that's still true because you're idiots, you rockists. But now, for most people, you can like, not just like as fans, anything you want, but just like in the 1980s, you as an artist now and back then could create anything you wanted and create your identity in the studio as your own producer. The backlash was baked in. I love this one. By pushing polish and control and spectacle to their extremes, it made everybody sick of them. And while that has happened with some things, music industry getting a hold of a trend and driving it into the ground and killing it. It happened with disco, it happened with grunge, and stuff like that. It never happened quite as abruptly as the switch over from the late 80s to the early 90s. And so even the rebellion follows this 80s blueprint. Again, what you're rebelling against is that 1980s sound and aesthetic. And I'm going to talk about this backlash more in the 90s episode, but basically to say that the reason the 80s weren't just lightly rejected or modified, as happened from the 70s through the 80s or the 60s to the 70s, and even the 90s to the 2000s, they were fought against actively, and it's because the second half of the decade just went too far. Hadn't happened before like that, and I don't think it's happened since. It certainly hasn't happened since. So it's understandable why it took the 80s so long to be respected again. The 1980s created the modern listener. What it achieved? Listeners learned to expect precision, power, sonic identity, immediate emotional content, quantization and stuff like that, and samples and mixing of genres. People understand production more. They understand the different genres more. They hear compression more. They hear space and texture as part of the meaning of the song. And as a modern listener, if you want to know which songs and albums to check out and truly understand the 1980s music development and changes in production, check out the bonus M Extra at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre, where I'll give you some recommended listening. Let's get to some final conclusions. The 80s didn't just change how records sounded, they changed what they were. They became designed objects, repeatable experiences, sonic identities. No such thing. What was it? Why do I say no such thing? Was it the best decade for production? No. I know it wasn't. You know it wasn't. Was it the worst? No, because there is no such thing. There were some amazing things happen in the 80s, but the 80s was, had some issues as far as how far it went with the tinniness and with the reverb and things like that. But that's also because it was sandwiched between two decades that stressed middle and bottom frequencies over the high ones. The 70s, very middle. The 90s, very middle and bottom. And between two quite earnest periods in music, the early mid-70s were very heartfelt and earnest for good and bad reasons. And the early 90s, a grunge, and you had to be serious and you couldn't smile. And the 80s was more insouciant and, dare I say, gender fluid. Most of the decade was not my fave, but as you know, I've mentioned before, one of my sweet spots for production was 78 to 82. Even 83 and 84, pretty damn decent. But either way, that era was seminal for all else that's come after. So I would say the first half of the 80s were one of the best eras for production history for almost all kinds of music. Second half was far less important in general, except for hip hop and EDM, which wouldn't be what they became without the late 80s. So the final answer is don't underestimate how important the 80s were for music production. Every decade since, whether it embraced polish, or chasing rawness, or toggling between the two, has been working inside of the framework that the 1980s built. And I know this because no matter how my music and production styles have changed, the general way I operate and structure and mix are all rooted in what I learned in and from the 1980s and the 90s. Which, speaking of how I create, the featured song. And yes, it's a bit of a longer episode, but the 80s were important. Wreck, my band, doesn't sound like the 80s, but the album KITE to CAMDEN thinks like the 80s. That's what a reviewer wrote online about Wreck's epic album KITE to CAMDEN. Stream it everywhere. So I'm going to pick a song from that album, and it's called Almost Everything About You. It is clearly techno mixed with rock, genre mixing, electronic, live instruments, which makes it 80s even if it doesn't quite sound like the 80s. It's emotional, it's cheeky, it has dynamic range, and it is highly danceable. It's about a guy trying to come to terms with his current relationship, realizing it's part delusion, and that he doesn't love everything about his partner, but that you don't need to, and just live in the delusion, that's good enough. Did it work out for him? No. But it's a fun song anyway. Please click the link, stream it, like it, share it, playlist it, and just wait. In less than a minute, you're going to hear it. Questions: how do you feel about 1980s production values? Can you hear the clear difference between the first and second halves of the decade? Who were your favorite producers, favorite productions? Which production developments do you feel most shaped the music in subsequent decades? I want to know the answers to all of this and more, because as always, my objectives are music, conversation, and connection. Thanks for hanging with me for this slightly longer episode, and I will talk to you next week.
I love almost everything about you.